On January 10th, 49 BC, Julius Caesar, leading a legion absolutely loyal to him, crossed the Rubicon River and declared war on the Senate. After 2 protracted civil wars, 22 years later, Octavian would be hailed as Augustus, finally ending the chaos of the late Roman Republic and ushering in the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. In a stunning coincidence, exactly 1 year later, on January 10th, 48 BC, the emperor of the Han Dynasty, Emperor Xuan, died of illness at the age of 43. The golden age he had created, the zenith of Han, Xiaoxuanzhiji, came to an end. But unlike the rising Roman Empire, with the death of Emperor Xuan, the Han Empire began a rapid decline, meeting an unnatural death just 60 years later. But this does not diminish Emperor Xuan's achievements. On the Chinese internet today, he is hailed by young people as China's best ruler. He held 2 unmatched records. One was the largest. The Protectorate of the Western Regions he established in 60 BC brought over 2 million square kilometers of land under the dynasty's control, pushing the Han Empire to its territorial peak, even surpassing the famed martial emperor, Emperor Wu. The other was the lowest. In 62 BC, he presided over the lowest grain prices ever officially recorded in Chinese history. 9 kilograms of staple grain cost only 5 coins, roughly 1/3 of today's international grain prices. And his accomplishments didn't stop there. He compelled the surrender of the empire's 150-year-old nemesis, the Xiongnu, without a major war. He implemented policies in the western frontier that became a blueprint for governing borderlands for centuries. He established the ever-normal granary system, a model for price stabilization that would be copied by later dynasties. He convened a great council of scholars, officially incorporating the Confucian school of thought he favored into the state orthodoxy. He endorsed Sima Qian's Records of the Grand Historian and had it distributed throughout the empire. And in his personal life, his story with the wife of his humble youth created 2 of China's most famous idioms about enduring love. So why have you likely never heard of this emperor, a man who was a paragon in both his public and private life? Because in China's official historical narrative for the past 2,000 years, the evaluation of him can be summed up in 3 words: not denied, not promoted, not perfect. Not denied, because he single-handedly created one of the most brilliant golden ages in classical Chinese history. To deny him would be to deny that miracle. Not promoted, because despite being honored as a restorer of the dynasty, and yet he has never been lionized by the state in the same way as the dynasty's titans, Liu Bang the founder, Liu Che the conqueror, or Liu Shu the restorer. His legacy is so muted that he is even overshadowed by the legend of Liu Bei, a tragic hero from a later age, famous for his valiant but failed attempt to save the Han. And not perfect, this is the most direct proof of the official attitude. In the historical records, after grudgingly acknowledging the great era he created, there is always harsh criticism of his vision, his governing philosophy, his personality, even his choice of heir. A complete evaluation, it seems, must include a degree of denigration.
Hello everyone and welcome to China Puzzle. I'm ZYQ. Today we're going to talk about the details of Emperor Xuan's rule and the verdict of history upon him. Unlike his legendary early life, his later life, despite its incredible achievements, failed to shine brightly in the annals of Chinese history. As we delve deeper into the reasons, the truth of a great puzzle begins to emerge. His obscurity was no accident. It was the result of a tacit, centuries-long collaboration between later ruling classes and Confucian scholars. Forget him, do not learn from him, abandon his path. First, let's look at who criticized him and how. The written criticisms of Emperor Xuan mainly come from 2 sources. The first is the official histories written by Confucian scholars. In ancient China, this meant a total monopoly on public opinion. The most classic example can be found in the renowned Zizhi Tongjian. This monumental work, written by the great Confucian master Sima Guang, was not a public history book, but rather a confidential reference manual intended only for the emperor's eyes, a guide on how to rule. In it, Sima Guang's verdict on Emperor Xuan can be summarized as follows. While Emperor Xuan was undoubtedly a capable ruler, he was excessively harsh with his ministers and overly strict in his enforcement of the law. He failed to grant a second chance to those officials who had committed capital crimes, an inflexibility that not only became a great stain on his good governance, but was also unbecoming of an enlightened sovereign. Another Confucian master, Zhu, argued that Emperor Xuan was one of the originators of the later plague of eunuch interference in politics. The scholar Wang Fuji reached a similar conclusion, believing Emperor Xuan was arrogant and liked to promote his personal favorites. The other source of criticism comes from later emperors. The most famous is the Qianlong Emperor of the Qing Dynasty, who listed several faults: improper rewards and punishments, a failure to use moral education, a confusion of public and private affairs, a refusal to rule with benevolence, and the wrong choice of heir. So, are these criticisms correct? The answer to this is tied to another key question. How did Emperor Xuan achieve his governing successes in the first place? Let's set aside complex theories and look at the simplest question. How was the pie divided?
By the time Emperor Xuan took the throne, the Han Dynasty had been established for nearly 150 years. The era was vastly different from the early days. Back then, the empire was slowly recovering from devastation. The core principle of that era's good governance was simple: don't rock the boat. The court avoided extravagance and war, practiced rest and recuperation, and let the people get on with their lives. This was the process of making the pie bigger. In a growing economy, many conflicts, especially over unfair distribution, are hidden because everyone believes that tomorrow will be better. But by Emperor Xuan's time, a 150-year-old empire had inevitably produced many vested interest groups. The wealth the land could generate was finite. The most critical problem for the ruler was no longer how to make the pie bigger, but how to divide it more fairly. On this point, Emperor Xuan's answer was unmistakable. First, his suppression of powerful clans, high officials, and even imperial princes was relentless. There is a vivid example. Since the Qin dynasty, there had been a seemingly ruthless policy called the tomb relocation. A powerful emperor would build his mausoleum near the capital and forcibly relocate powerful families from the provinces to live in the tomb city. In other words, under the guise of honoring the emperor, it was a way to uproot powerful clans from their local power bases and place them under the capital's watchful eye. As you can imagine, this policy faced immense resistance. By the mid-Han Dynasty, its execution had been greatly watered down. For instance, when Emperor Xuan first took the throne and Huo Guang was in charge, the relocation for the previous emperor's tomb was based on volunteering and compensation, a far cry from the original intent. But what about when Emperor Xuan built his own tomb? By then he had purged the Huo clan and held power firmly in his own hands. He executed the policy of his ancestors without compromise, targeting the elite. Not only were wealthy and powerful families to be forcibly moved to his tomb city of dueling, but no rank was spared from this decree. The order included members of the highest echelons of power. Chancellors, generals, and even the hereditary marquises found themselves on the relocation list. The number of powerful families forced to move was so great that centuries later, during the Tang dynasty, famous figures like the poet Du Fu still hailed from the great clans of dueling. Furthermore, the official histories record that during his reign, 8 high officials of the 2,000 Dan rank were executed, and 5 feudal kings were deposed or exiled, not to mention the several thousand families exterminated in the purge of the Huo clan. It can be said that before Emperor Xuan, the legalist principle that a prince who breaks the law is judged the same as a commoner was taken to its extreme. He himself was a diligent ruler, holding court meetings every 5 days without fail. He gave his high officials great authority, but also crushing key performance indicators. He could be called China's first practitioner of KPI-based administration.
So, under Emperor Xuan, the lives of the vested interest groups were not easy. They were forced to move. Their official status became more of a burden than a privilege, and when the state needed resources, the emperor looked to them first. Under this high pressure, their resentment was inevitable, and this resentment in turn became the reason for their downfall. What a tyrant.
Now, let's switch perspectives. How did Emperor Xuan treat the common people? First, he gave them a clean government. In addition to punishing corrupt officials, this emperor from a commoner background made a special effort to promote good officials who genuinely served the people's welfare. There's a great example, a man named Gong Sui. Remember him? He was the tutor to the prince who was deposed after 27 days on the throne. He was one of the very few in the prince's entourage who was not executed. After Emperor Xuan took power, he heard of Gong Sui's integrity and summoned him, intending to appoint him governor of the chaotic Bohai region. Gong Sui, now over 70, was asked by the concerned emperor, "The place you are going has been in chaos for years, overrun with bandits. How will you govern?" Gong Sui replied, "The people there are far from the emperor's grace, plagued by hunger and cold." The previous officials showed them no compassion. That's why they play with weapons in the swamps. They are not bandits. Does your majesty want me to suppress them with force or to pacify them? Emperor Xuan was pleased. "I am appointing a worthy official, of course, because I wish to pacify the people." He gave Gong Sui many gifts and sent him off in a carriage befitting an imperial envoy. Upon arriving in Bohai, Gong Sui's first decree was that anyone holding a hoe or a sickle was a farmer, not a bandit. The rebels immediately threw down their weapons and picked up their tools. Gong Sui then provided them with grain from the state. He then personally encouraged the people to plant trees and raise livestock, and even persuaded them to trade their swords for plow oxen. Under his tireless efforts, Bohai quickly became prosperous. Years later, the elderly Gong Sui was recalled to the capital to serve as a high court official and died in office at a ripe old age, becoming a model for all future upright administrators. Second, knowing the hardships of the people, Emperor Xuan paid special attention to the justice system. During his reign, he made 4 major adjustments to the law. First, for the first time in Chinese legal history, he established the principle that close relatives could conceal each other's crimes without being prosecuted. Second, he gave legal preferential treatment to the elderly and the weak. In fact, those over 80 were granted almost complete judicial immunity. Third, he established a strict accountability system for prisons, cracking down on unnatural deaths. And fourth, he severely punished judicial injustice. In addition, he established the ever-normal granary to stabilize grain prices. He voluntarily reduced the price of salt from the state monopoly. He repeatedly reduced taxes, provided loans to the poor, and leased public land to them at extremely low rents. He institutionalized rewards for widows and orphans and sent envoys to inspect the provinces, specifically to inquire about the welfare of the elderly and the lonely.
In the 20-odd years of his reign, we see 41 imperial edicts reducing taxes and rewarding the people, yet not a single record of increasing taxes or imposing new labor levies. There is an interesting record in the histories. An official saw that Emperor Xuan's clothes were too lavish and his carriage too ornate, and wrote a blunt memorial criticizing him, saying he was just like the extravagant Emperor Wu. Emperor Xuan did not punish this nitpicking official, but perhaps we can view this piece of information as the ultimate counter-evidence. Even the court's professional nitpickers, the remonstrance officials, could not find a single example of Emperor Xuan launching extravagant projects that exhausted the people and drained the treasury. In fact, during his entire reign, aside from the construction of his mausoleum, a compulsory duty for any emperor, he renovated just one garden on the site of the old Qin Dynasty Yichun Garden, where he had often played as a child. As for the rest, his decree was simple and absolute. All royal palaces and lodges throughout the provinces and commanderies are no longer to be repaired. He proactively halted all repair and new construction on royal residences across the entire empire. So, how to divide the pie? Isn't Emperor Xuan's answer obvious? He used high-pressure tactics to extract wealth from the vested interest groups, not for his own luxury, but as capital to benefit all the people. The inevitable result of such a choice was that this emperor could never win the love of the elite class. They may not have dared to oppose him while he was alive, but after his death, they would surely slander his name.
We can cite one more example. A man mentioned in the Zizhi Tongjian, Yang Yun. He was the grandson of the great historian Sima Qian. He had exposed the Huo clan's rebellion plot and was rewarded by Emperor Xuan with a high rank. It was he who presented the Records of the Grand Historian to the emperor, allowing it to be officially circulated. But later, Yang Yun, proud of his talent, often disagreed with the emperor's policies and came into direct conflict with another official promoted by the emperor. He was accused of making disrespectful remarks about the emperor in private, even comparing him to the infamous tyrants of ancient times. This detail shows that even with high office and great wealth, Emperor Xuan still could not win the true recognition of the elite. What was the result? Did Emperor Xuan have his head chopped off? No. He actually gave him a chance. The emperor, in an act of political wisdom, punished both men in the conflict by demoting them to commoners. But Yang Yun, after being dismissed, was unrepentant. He wrote a long, eloquent letter expressing his extreme resentment and his break with the court and the emperor. It was a declaration of, "We walk different paths." Emperor Xuan finally lost his patience. The court of justice sentenced him to death for high treason. He was cut in half at the waist.
So, our second question, why, more than 1,000 years later, when the aristocrats and powerful clans that Emperor Xuan had suppressed had long since turned to dust, did later Confucian scholars and the scholar official class still have to tarnish his name? This is a very complex and profound question, but we can distill it down to one key point. How should the pyramid of power be constructed? In fact, for an empire of China's size, governance is always about the distribution of power and compromise. Over thousands of years, countless dynasties experimented with various paths, eventually leading to the stable, though conservative, balance between absolute imperial power and the scholar official bureaucracy that characterized the late imperial era. Emperor Xuan's governing philosophy was one of the paths that was ultimately abandoned in this process of trial and error. Let's break down the power structure he built.
First, who's really in charge? This seemingly obvious question was not without controversy in the Han Dynasty. Emperor Xuan himself, after being placed on the throne, spent several years with thorns on his back, as all matters of state were decided solely by the Grand Marshal Huo Guang. Even after Huo Guang nominally returned power to the emperor, all official documents were made in duplicate, one for the emperor, one for the Grand Marshal, until Huo Guang's death. This kind of situation was common in the Han Dynasty. From Empress Lu's regency to Wang Mang's usurpation, to the consort clan and eunuch dominance of the late Eastern Han, being emperor was no guarantee of holding supreme power. But Emperor Xuan was different. In his dozen or so years of personal rule, he always held power firmly in his own hands, never delegating it to others. Then the division between imperial power and the power of the chancellery. Even the most diligent emperor cannot manage an empire of millions of square kilometers and tens of millions of people alone. He is not an omniscient god. He must delegate some power to the bureaucracy. And this is precisely one of the real reasons why later scholar officials and Confucian scholars fiercely attacked Emperor Xuan. He delegated too little, and he controlled too much. On one hand, we see a monarch who attended to every detail of governance. On the other hand, the bureaucracy saw a strong man who monopolized power. Their ideal emperor was a leader who held ultimate authority, but the bureaucracy was supposed to be a complementary partner, not, as under Emperor Xuan, merely the executor of his personal will. In political terms, he was a dictator. Moreover, this autocratic emperor not only failed to give the bureaucracy more freedom, but he also used his authority to suppress their overreach. We can cite another example, a man named Gai Quan Rao. This famous Confucian official was known for his blunt remonstrations. He repeatedly criticized the emperor's governing philosophy, strongly urging him to rule according to orthodox Confucian principles rather than the legalist ideas that emphasized law and punishment. When he finally suggested that the emperor should emulate the sage kings of antiquity and abdicate the throne to a more virtuous man, Emperor Xuan's patience ran out. He ordered the high officials to debate his crimes. But before a final verdict could be reached, Gai Quan Rao committed suicide at the north gate of the palace. This act of remonstrating with death immediately elevated Gai Quan Rao to the status of a historical martyr while casting Emperor Xuan as a tyrant. If not for Emperor Xuan's own dazzling achievements, this incident alone would have been enough to ruin his reputation for eternity. Next, let's look at who the emperor trusted and appointed. Nominally, the head of the administration should be the chancellor. But in reality, since the time of Emperor Wu, ambitious emperors had grown increasingly weary of the chancellery's criticisms and had sought ways to circumvent its power. They preferred to appoint relatives and eunuchs, a phenomenon known as the inner court dominating the outer court. On this point, Emperor Xuan's actions were not the most egregious, but they certainly did not endear him to the bureaucracy. He relied on capable chancellors from the outer court, but he also continuously promoted his consort clan relatives, and he was said to trust his eunuchs. This was anathema to the scholar officials. They could tolerate a dictatorial emperor, they could tolerate their own diminishing power, but they could not tolerate seeing the emperor's in-laws and castrated eunuchs placed above them. In the power struggles of the next 2,000 years, the bureaucracy would spend centuries solving the consort clan problem, and another 1,000 years to completely solve the eunuch problem. But at this moment, they had to endure the emperor's nepotism. And this is where their criticism of him was the harshest. The curse, "May he have no heirs," was one of the most severe in the Confucian tradition.
Finally, our third question. Since the conflict was between the imperial power and the elite class, why did later emperors who occupied the same position also criticize Emperor Xuan? Simply put, they were jealous and they were sober. They were jealous because they saw his extraordinary talent, his genius-level intelligence and emotional acuity, and the miraculous splendor he achieved through a combination of personal ability and historical circumstance. They were sober because they knew this was an extreme exception. Emperor Xuan's background and early experiences were unrepeatable. His deep understanding of the lower strata of society was unrepeatable. His personal character was unrepeatable. His diligence, wisdom, and brilliance were nearly impossible to replicate. And the power structure he built to realize his ambitions, if it fell into the hands of a mediocre ruler, would be twisted into an irredeemable tyranny. Most of the time, the man on the dragon throne is not a genius or a saint, but an ordinary person like you or me. Without an effective system to constrain imperial power, the result would be the systemic collapse of the entire empire. Therefore, later emperors did not like heroes, because heroes are hard to copy. China would not see another hero emperor from a commoner background for another 1400 years until the Ming Dynasty.
In all fairness, this is perhaps the truest, most correct, and most frustrating of the many negative evaluations of Emperor Xuan. The fact is, after his death, the Han Dynasty slid down this clearly visible path towards the abyss. When his own son, the Crown Prince, pleaded with him to adopt the more benevolent principles of Confucianism in his governance, Emperor Xuan, looking at his unperceptive son, angrily uttered his most famous words about his governing philosophy. The House of Han has its own system, which mixes the way of the king with the way of the tyrant. Why should we rely purely on moral teaching and use the governance of the Zhou dynasty? Besides, these vulgar scholars do not understand the times. They love to praise the past and criticize the present, confusing people with names and realities and not knowing what to uphold. How can they be entrusted with great responsibility? Finally, he said in frustration, "The one who will bring ruin to my house is the crown prince." And this crown prince, later Emperor Xuan, as a mediocre emperor, indeed lacked his father's political skill and rationality. Under the influence of the Confucian school, he gradually abandoned his father's governing philosophy, replacing the high-pressure tactics against the vested interest groups with benevolent governance. The concentration of wealth and land that had been a problem since the mid-Han Dynasty thus became uncontrollable, and his vigorous promotion of Confucianism directly led to the rise of an anti-Han sentiment among Confucian scholars in the late Western Han, making it possible for the time traveler Wang Mang to usurp the throne. More than 200 years of glorious achievement were doomed to collapse the moment Emperor Xuan died. We finally discover an interesting answer. Why did the Qianlong Emperor of the Qing dynasty dislike Emperor Xuan so much? One possible reason is that Emperor Xuan was just too much like his own father, the Yongzheng Emperor. They were both diligent and intelligent. They both suppressed the powerful clans. They both implemented high-pressure controls. They both gave real benefits to the common people. They both reigned for little more than a decade, yet completely reversed the mid-dynasty decline and strengthened the state. And they both bore much undeserved slander.
The age of imperial power is long gone. As a history channel, we do not wish to, nor are we able to, judge the merits of a political ideology. All we can say is that in every era, the choices available to every person are quite limited. We just want to remember that 2,000 years ago in China, there was an emperor who, when he found that his common name was causing many of his subjects to be inadvertently convicted of a crime for merely mentioning it in their letters, made a choice to change his own name. This point may seem trivial, but in the entire history of China, only 2 emperors ever made such a genuinely considerate move for the sake of the people. Finally, for our musical recitation for this episode, we have chosen a Han Dynasty Fu, a prose poem by the scholar Wang Bao from Emperor Xuan's era, called Fu on the Pan Flute. This is not a song of praise for great deeds, nor a cry of lament for lost love. Rather, it expresses the Chinese philosophical idea of using local materials and making the best use of everything. Practicality. This perhaps was the core element of all of Emperor Xuan's thought.
乐府小干之所生兮，于江南之秋徐。相逢萧萧而尽其末兮，回江流川而盖其山。故听其巨音，则周流四烂，并包土海，若慈父之续子也。其妙声，则清净演绎，顺序悲达，若孝子之弑父也。蓬荜慷慨，以和壮士，优柔温润，又是君子。故饕餮者，听之而怜欲兮；刚毅强暴，反仁恩兮；垂称之而入道德兮。故永裕而可贵。终思逐取，尚于殷兮。